We're moving ahead in time. We're moving north, as you can see from this map, but we're also actually going to be looking at the Mediterranean. And if there's time, I suspect there won't be, I'm even going to try and include the Far East. I'm actually very grateful to David Butterfield for what he said at a particular point towards the end, which is the importance of maritime trade and the way in which it was actually much cheaper to conduct that sort of trade than to take overland routes. And, well, I got yesterday from the British Museum the advertisement of their marvellous Silk Roads exhibition, which is coming up in the autumn. And my immediate reaction was to say, wait a moment, this is actually such an out-of-date approach to the history of trade in Eurasia. We now know that the maritime routes carried far more goods. I mean, we heard about millions and millions of pieces of ceramics in Monte Testaccio, shipwrecks found in Indonesia with 500,000 or even 1 million pieces of Chinese ceramics bound for the Islamic world. So maritime trade is one of the things which is going to be my focus, and also this very important distinction between long-distance trade and short-distance trade. Short-distance trade very often in those everyday necessities like grain and wax, and also we have to remember slaves, and then long-distance trade which might, for instance, in the Baltic involve amber. In the Mediterranean, it might involve spices which have been carried all the way from Indonesia by sea, as I said just a moment ago, along the so-called Silk Route of the Sea, up the Red Sea, through Alexandria into the Mediterranean. Now, that's the sort of picture we're looking at in the medieval period. But what I want to begin with is really a series of questions. One of them is to what extent markets were bound up actually with towns. And this is a story which turns on the whole way in which markets can develop into towns. There was a great debate among historians about 100 years ago. Henri Pirenne, a very great Belgian historian who had various ideas about the origins of towns and sort of classified various ways in which towns could come into existence. And one of them was obviously as mercantile centres, but also as administrative centres, military centres. You can imagine, if there's a castle there, that sort of thing. Now, that's one aspect that we need to think about in the next, I've got fewer than 15 minutes now. We've also got to ask ourselves to what extent these places were controlled by rulers, to what extent actually it's the other side, a totally different picture, in which they benefit from the opportunity effectively to run their own affairs. They're self-regulating institutions. And we'll see, well, there's quite a variety of answers to that sort of question. We need to ask ourselves what sort of continuity there was from the Roman world. Well, clearly not in the Baltic, because that was beyond the Roman world, but even in the Mediterranean, we have some question marks. Two of the most important centres of Mediterranean trade in the early Middle Ages, Venice and Amalfi, had in effect no Roman antecedents. And yet they became the major centres of trade in the case of Amalfi towards the Islamic world, towards Constantinople, the Venetians also following in that sort of line, building up these links with Alexandria and Constantinople and so on. So the continuity seems to have been broken, but nonetheless, these rather extraordinary commercial centres, in the case of Venice, scattered across islands in a lagoon. In the case of Amalfi, actually lots of little villages scattered on the Sorrentine Peninsula. That's what we call Amalfi, none of them of any particular size. So questions of continuity are very important. All right, so let's turn from that sort of general series of questions to some issues which I think come out most clearly in the Baltic region, and that is the way in which temporary seasonal markets can turn into fairs, and the fairs can turn into permanent institutions. permanent institutions becoming the focus for urban settlement. So we can begin in the Baltic with beach markets, where in the Viking period, ships would come up to particular beaches and they would build some huts for a few weeks, and various commodities would be traded there. And this sort of thing, very much seasonally determined, of course, in the area of Sweden along here, Skåne, you've got the famous herring fisheries. And I mean, the herrings actually decide they want to swim around in the North Sea later on. So the fairs, the Swedish fairs, go out of fashion. But this was a seasonal operation on an absolutely massive scale. I mean, you have descriptions of the herrings gathering in those waters, and if you actually walked out into the sea, walked off the beach, apparently you could hardly move for fish which kept sort of swimming around your legs. It sounds really rather unpleasant. So, and, you know, we can think of other examples in the same sort of category. Bergen, on the coast of Norway, the Norwegian kings actually forbidding Hanseatic German merchants from coming in the 13th century to take away codfish at certain periods of the year. That was the great export from Bergen, because what they needed was grain. So unless the German merchants brought in grain, no codfish. So again, it's very much a sort of seasonal thing, which one has to bear in mind. And this takes me then to this theme of the importance in the medieval world of fairs. This is taking us a little bit inland. The great Champagne fairs, the fairs of the Flemish cities in the 12th, 13th centuries. It's still related to the sea, because a lot of the merchants who came up to Champagne came all the way from Italy, from Genoa, for instance, which had a very active trade in textiles, and these Flemish textiles being channeled down through Champagne. So being there at the right time, it was all to do with the sort of seasonal variations which were taking place in these areas. Let me give you an example of a fair in England, which brings up a very interesting dimension to the role of fairs. The Sturbridge Fair, which was at its peak apparently one of the very largest in Europe, and founded, or at least given its charter in 1199 by King John, just outside Cambridge. And the interesting thing about this is that there was tax exemption. And that really, that is something which was absolutely fundamental to the way in which these fairs operated, lowering or even abolishing for certain merchants taxes, protection of merchants as they move across the roads towards these fairs and at the fairs themselves. So one of the fundamental features of the way in which fairs and then subsequently urban markets develop is the opportunity that rulers might have to provide protection for foreign merchants. They begin to understand, of course, that even if, for instance, they reduce the taxation, as we see very often in areas like the Crusader Kingdom or in Constantinople, so taxation of Genoese and Venetian merchants might even be reduced to nothing. And yet, there were enormous financial killings to be made out of doing this, because, of course, these Italian merchants had to deal with the local merchants to acquire the goods they wanted. And the local merchants would be paying taxes, and those taxes would then go into the royal coffers. The whole volume of trade increasing exponentially, it turned into a very clever way of exploiting trade, while at the same time appearing to give extremely handsome privileges to these foreign merchants. Now, one particular feature of as we begin to see market towns emerge, one particular feature that I want to stress is how many of them in the sort of early Middle Ages, so say up to the 12th, beginning of the 13th centuries, we're looking at places which are often situated on borders. And this comes back to my point about these communities being in many ways self-regulating communities. So Lübeck, for instance, right, the Emperor Frederick II gave in the 13th century a great privilege to Lübeck, which had been founded by Henry the Lion, the local duke, in the 12th century. And the whole idea there was to give these merchants who were poised on the border of what was still very largely pagan Eastern Europe, to give them freedom to trade. And we see this again when we start moving northwards. We move from Lübeck, which is just there, and we move up to Gotland, and we start looking at the role of the German merchants there, setting up. I mean, if you go to Visby nowadays, you can still see what is now the Cathedral of Visby was the German church, St. Mary's, and this community which settled there, which received royal protection, and so on. So these communities which became self-regulating, and in some cases, a particular phenomenon we see is the granting of special rights to foreign merchants. So, for instance, in Bergen, the Hanseatic merchants had, and you can still get a sense of this if you go to Bergen nowadays, they had this area where they were sort of packed into this tight space. At night, they couldn't go out of it, and there were very strict regulations imposed by the German merchants themselves on their apprentices and so on. But these areas which had a particular, if you like, national identity, which were centres of foreign trade. But generally, when we look at these centres of trade, it seems to me what we are looking at is a great deal of social, ethnic and religious mixing. And the cases that come to mind in this context, if we were to take, for instance, Palermo in the 12th century, we have the most amazing documentation, the so-called Cairo Geniza documents, mostly preserved in Cambridge. And these documents, letters written by merchants, Jewish merchants from Egypt, but we have this image of Palermo as a city in which Muslims, Jews, Christians, living under the rule of the Norman kings, living side by side, interacting in trade and socially as well. So that's one of the very interesting features, it seems to me, of the port cities, that they tend to be, and we can extend this beyond the Middle Ages, they tend to be places of great ethnic variety. I mean, an interesting example of this, Crimea, which has been so much in the news, this actually contained one of the great Genoese centres of operation in not just the Black Sea, but in the whole Genoese trading network, a town called Caffa, now known as Feodossia, in the southeastern corner of Crimea. And there we find that the Genoese, in this town of perhaps 50,000 people, a large town by the standards of the time in the 13th, 14th centuries, Genoese were sort of an elite. And the actual population, very mercantile in character, Armenians, Tatars, or Mongols, if you prefer to call them that, Jews, Greeks, all the ethnic groups who lived anywhere near the Black Sea tended to gather there, and very much, of course, to the benefit of the taxation authorities of the city of Genoa. We also have cases like Bruges, right? Bruges, not actually on a sort of not on the very margins of Europe, but nonetheless, if you go to Bruges nowadays, it's very interesting. You see how the Hanseatic network in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, the Italian network, join together this place. And you go to the centre of Bruges, and you will see the House of the Easterlings, that's to say the Hanseatic merchants. And you will see almost next to it, House of the Florentines. And then just beyond that, the House of the Genoese, which is a beautiful late 14th century little palace. Unfortunately, it is now the Belgian National Fried Potato Museum, which I think has rather reduced its sort of appeal, if you like. So, all right, so I've only got 1 minute left, and what I want to say in that 1 minute is that this sort of image of the way in which markets develop in towns between different sort of ethnic, religious groups and so on, a place where they can meet together. It's something we see, of course, in the Far East as well, in exactly the same period, in the 12th century, when there was a sort of commercial revolution going on in China, just at the same time as we see one going on in Europe. The city of Changzhou and also the trade routes, I've mentioned these extraordinary trade routes bringing ceramics all the way to the Mediterranean from China in that period. So markets as places which are very often on boundaries and very often linking very different ethnic, religious and cultural groups. Thank you very much.
That's the question.
Oh, do you have a question?
Yes, just one question. Thank you very much. I think you have places like Lübeck, Bruges, Venice. They managed to be around for an extended period of time. I mean, they're still there, but they were mercantile superpowers for a long time. Other places like Hedeby in Denmark, for instance, and Birka in Sweden, they faded away. What's the main reason for decline of these marketplaces?
Yes, I mean, there are all sorts, as I understand it, I'm not an expert on the Vikings, but as I understand it, in the case of Birka and in the case of Hedeby, there are a lot of political complications at that particular point once we get into the 11th century. And so you're quite right. All the evidence suggests that they've passed their peak. That they're no longer such important centres of trade. And the major focus of trade by then has tended to move out towards the open sea. And I mentioned Gotland, and you've got this exceptionally active trade, for instance, in Russian furs, with Russian merchants coming in to Gotland and in considerable numbers. I mean, they had a church in Visby. So I think it's partly to do with shifts in sort of patterns of trade demand, all that sort of thing, and also the political complications with the consolidation of political control, kings of Denmark, rulers of Sweden, and so on, and transformations at the end of the Viking Age.
All right. Thank you very much.